while, the life of Gideon, he gets a large chunk of the story of Joshua because he does some pretty amazing things, but his sons are a different story. And as we've built up the rise and fall of Abimelech, we just want to be reminded that Gideon, despite all the good things that he had done, he left his people and his family on a sour note. He left a stumbling block for his family. If you remember, he made this golden ephod, which is like this almost like this armor plate that ended up being a point of contention for his family, and they kind of coveted it and were jealous of it, caused his family and the people of Israel to stumble. He left a muddled lineage because he had many wives, and if you remember, he had 70 sons. And so there was an issue that arose that we'll talk about in just a minute because of that. And then, unfortunately, like many of the judges, he left a very short-lived legacy because the people, upon his death, quickly turned again to the idols that had ensnared them before, had again captured them. Now, all of this is invested into the life of Abimelech, one of the sons, or maybe even the favored son of Gideon. And he ends up being the star, you could say, of Judges, chapter 9. And really gets very extensive, besides maybe Samson, gets a lot written about him because he is what's called a cautionary tale. His is a story of what not to do, how not to raise your kids, how not to build your nation, how not to honor the Lord ultimately. And if you remember the rise of Abimelech, he built his kingship, really it's a false kingship, by choosing his mother's pagan family over his own father's godly heritage. His mother was from Shechem. She was a Canaanite. She was probably an idol worshiper. And his father was Gideon, a judge of Israel, the promised people. So he forsook the ways of Gideon, embraced the ways of his mother, chose their family, and he proceeded to build his kingship on violence and treachery, even against his own brothers, by murdering 70 of them on one stone with the help of his fellow townsmen in Shechem. After that, we saw that one brother did survive this slaughter, and this brother Jotham utters a curse. Now, it's not quite a prophecy in the sense that he's a prophet of any sort, but it is God using this only remaining son of Gideon to pronounce judgment upon the people of Shechem, who aided and embedded Abimelech, and also Abimelech himself. And today, finally, we will see the downfall of Abimelech. We start off in verse 21, and we see the hostility heightening. Judges 9:22. Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years. And God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, and the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech, that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, remember that's another name for Gideon, might come, and their blood be laid on Abimelech their brother who killed them, and on the men of Shechem who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. And the leaders of Shechem put men in ambush against him on the mountaintops, and they robbed all who passed by them along the way. In verse 22, we see that Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years. Now, that word rule is interesting because in the book of Judges, it's not ever said that anyone rules over anyone, because what were the judges supposed to do? Judge, not rule. They were saviors of Israel from their enemies, and upon saving them, they didn't rule and reign over them as a king, but they judged over them, meaning the people would bring their cases of justice to the judge, and the judge would simply give a judgment, God's judgment, on those issues. They were not to be kings. And yet here, Abimelech, he is said to rule. And this just points out that he wasn't neither truly a ruler, because the basis of his kingship was on violence, but he's not also a true judge or savior of the people. He is a false man. Now, verse 23 and 24 is interesting because we have the introduction of what's called an evil spirit. That God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, it seems, to stir up hostility. Now, the phrase evil spirit, it occurs 10 times in 9 verses of the Old Testament. It's almost always associated as coming from the Lord or from God, which is to say that this evil spirit seems to be under the divine control, you could say, of God himself. Now, most of the uses of the term evil spirit is not in Judges, but in 1 Samuel. If you remember in 1 Samuel, or in the book of 1 Samuel, you have the rise of the first actual kings of Israel, Saul and then David. And if you remember the stories, how Saul, after he became king, sort of went crazy. And this evil spirit would afflict him that David could somehow soothe or drive away by playing music for him. Does that sound familiar? So just for example, in almost every other case then of the use of the term evil spirit is from 1 Samuel. But 1 Samuel 16:14, now the spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from Yahweh tormented him. That term harmful spirit is actually the same phrase, evil spirit, and we'll get to the word evil or harmful in just a second. But just so you know, this is something that happens not very frequently in the Bible. Basically here and to Saul, to Abimelech and Shechem, the people of Shechem, and to Saul. Now, what does it mean, this evil spirit? Well, the word evil in Hebrew is ra, or ra. And it could mean morally evil, just your normal way you think of evil, right? Objectively evil, kicking cats and murder and things like that. But it could also mean natural disaster or calamity or just affliction in general. It doesn't always mean an evil act, like a morally evil, deprived act. Yeah, do you have a question? You can ask questions anytime you want. You have a question? Yeah, we're talking about that right now. This is a very good question. So the evil spirit, what does it mean? What does it do? Well, there's a way that this could also mean just disaster or harmful is the way it translated in 1 Samuel. It's a harmful spirit, not an evil spirit, even though it's the same word, ra or rat. So look at Isaiah 45:7. You don't have to turn there, but this is a passage that gets quoted sometimes by people who say, oh, the Bible has contradictions. Oh, God is a menace. He's an evil, wicked person, just like all the other pagan gods. Because Isaiah 45:7 says, I form light. That's talking about God. God is saying, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am Yahweh who does all these things. Now, depending on your translation, it might say, I make well-being or peace and create evil. Because the word calamity there is that same word, ra. Now, the word for well-being there is the word shalom, which you've probably heard before. It's a Hebrew word for peace. So this word ra is actually just the opposite of that in this context. Well, what's the opposite of peace or well-being? It's destruction, harm, chaos. Not necessarily moral evil or something objectively evil, but just something not pleasant that you wouldn't like, whether it's natural disaster, calamity, harm, and things like that. So it's possible here that people have a problem with God sending an evil spirit. Well, there's one way to look at it. It's not like an evil spirit, but a spirit that just causes disruption, that encourages, calamity and destruction. Now, it still doesn't seem like such a great thing, but then again, Isaiah 45:7, that God creates those things in some way. So it's not morally or objectively evil, but it's something that's unpleasant and not good, and God does do at times things that are not particularly pleasant, but are ultimately good for us. What do we mean by spirit then? That covers the evil part. What about the spirit part? Well, this does refer most likely to some kind of angelic or demonic being. if it's the same kind of spirit that was being sent to Saul, the same idea, the sole intent of this being is to afflict and maybe you could say amplify the negative feelings that are already present. I say it that way because we want to avoid the idea that the devil made me do it, or that we can blame all of our actions on demonic activity. Certainly we believe that there are demons, that they afflict people, that they tempt people, and that people can be demon-possessed. But even for the demon-possessed person, oftentimes we want to say that there are things that happen that likely invited that demonic oppression into their lives. In other words, for Saul, his suspicious, jealous, spiteful heart was there to begin with. It's not that this evil spirit created that, it was already there. And like flies are drawn to dung, so it is that this evil spirit, sent by the Lord, ultimately under his divine control, was attracted to it, and it amplified. The spirit amplified, you could say, what was already there in Saul's heart. And it's likely the case something like this is also present or happening here, because Abimelech and Shechem, are they just like model citizens? Are they fantastic, good people, and it's so unfair that God sent this evil spirit to afflict them? No, you already know that Abimelech and Shechem are murderers. That Abimelech has, and it sounds later, personally murdered 70 of his own brothers in the same place, probably on the same day. He's not just someone that is being cursed by God for no good reason. There's some sense that the evil spirit's presence here is simply to amplify it so that it would turn into actions that would eventually consume. We'll get to that in a second as well. That the violence and treachery will be itself a judgment on itself. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, it is also possible that the idea of a spirit here is maybe not a personal demon or angel, but spirit meaning like an attitude, like a positive ways, like to have more team spirit. It's that attitude that we should have, or mentality. The Bible does sometimes use the word spirit that way too, so it could be the idea that God was planting or further exacerbating the discontent, suspicion, jealousy in the heart of Shechem and Abimelech as a judgment. So either way, it's not a good thing. Either way, it's part of a judgment. Either way, it doesn't bring Abimelech and Shechem an excuse. Well, this is not my fault. God did this to me. Either way, God is sovereign, and he's the one in charge of bringing a judgment in this way, without also himself being evil. It's God's deliberate action and choice to use an evil spirit to prompt these evil men to bring judgment upon each other by their evil acts and treachery and violence, being that was at one point put out, to others, but now it would be reflected back on them. So their own treachery, their own violence would come back on them as a form of judgment. So God is sovereign in that this is his plan. He sent the evil spirit, but we do not accuse God of doing evil himself, right? Now, Shechem, just by way of reminder, is a little map on the back of your handout if you want to look at that. But Shechem lay between two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, and one is to the north and one is to the south. I forgot which one was which, but it's on your map. And there's a road that ran through Shechem east and west, but if you also look to the right side of it, the east side of it, you also see a road going north and south. In other words, Shechem was a major hub. And that's why it becomes even the capital of the northern kingdom at some point, which we talked about a few weeks ago. So what happened was, as this spirit of treachery, violence, suspicion is stirred up in their hearts by this evil spirit, they enact this plan to harass and bother Abimelech. They start to lay ambush. So you can imagine in these mountains, and I think I've shown you a picture before, they would get up on these mountains, and from there you could spy out miles and miles and miles. And they'd see like a caravan coming down the road, and they would lay in wait for that caravan to come, and then they would rob it. Everyone that passed by that way. And again, there was a lot of traffic going through that town and around that town. You can almost, it's almost like an old Western, right? Where you got a bunch of bandits up on a hill, and they're spying out the train or, the Wells Fargo, what's it called, wagon, and they're going to go up and they're going to go rob it. It's exactly like that kind of imagery. And what's the point? What's the point of doing these ambushes and robberies? How does this bother Abimelech, who's probably living in Aruma, which is south and east there? Well, for one thing, it did keep Abimelech out of the town. So they're watching for Abimelech. They don't like him now, even though he's their guy. Certainly this would be an embarrassment to Abimelech, because this is the town that brought him his kingship. And now he can't even control it. He's not allowed in it. Everyone who goes by it is getting assaulted, and it's under his care. He's got no control here. Yeah, Nori. So to be made a king. So like an empire, like a king is in charge of a domain. So you could call, yeah? Yeah, all the lands that are under his control. So that's a way to put it. It's a funny word now that you mention it. Maybe I won't use it if I can't define it. So he's a king, yeah. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, it's not that story, but you know what? Now that you mention it, that would have made a really good connection here, because that king was super jealous, King Herod, and he's super evil. He killed a bunch of babies in Bethlehem, and not only that, he did also kill a bunch of his own family members. He was really mean, evil guy. He was just like Abimelech. So you actually get the idea, and one of the points we're going to make is that this kind of thing keeps happening in the Bible, where people get jealous. Well, I think he was influenced or tempted by the devil. We'll say that. Maybe he was demon-possessed too. I don't know that. But certainly you don't do that kind of thing without some of the devil really, pushing you, right? So that's a really good point, though, because part of the Bible's story is it's telling us that this kind of thing happens over and over again. And that means it's part of our nature. It's part of who we are to be jealous. It's part of who we are to be violent. And we're going to talk about it at the end. That's a really good example that I wish I'd thought up earlier. So thank you for bringing that up. I'll mention it at the end maybe a little bit more. All right, so we have in the first section there, the hostility is heightening. The temperature is being raised through this evil spirit, and the people of Shechem are starting to increase, right? The level of antagonism and the hostility there. Verses 26 through 33, a rival is revealed. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, moved into Shechem with his relatives, and the leaders of Shechem put confidence in him. And they went out into the field and gathered the grapes from their vineyards and trod them and held a festival. And they went into the house of their God and ate and drank and reviled Abimelech. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, "Who is Abimelech? And who are we of Shechem that we should serve him? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal and not Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem, but why should we serve him? Would that this people were under my hand, then I would remove Abimelech. I would say to Abimelech, increase your army and come out." When Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed, his anger was kindled, and he sent messengers to Abimelech secretly, saying, "Behold, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his relatives have come to Shechem, and they are stirring up the city against you. Now, therefore, go by night, you and the people who are with you, and set an ambush in the field. Then, in the morning, as soon as the sun is up, rise early and rush upon the city, and when he and the people who are with you come out against you, you may do to them as your hand finds to do." Now, this man Gaal We know nothing about him except what is revealed here. He's never spoken of before. He's never spoken of again. He is just a person that God is going to use to be the tipping point of this anger and hostility that's brewing in Shechem. Now, his name literally means abomination or contempt. Maybe it's God's way via name, as we talked about this morning, of pointing out that Abimelech is loathsome and contemptible. So his adversary, his rival here, his name literally means abominable or contemptible. And maybe there's a commentary there on Abimelech. And if you remember, Abimelech's name means my father is a king. Well, his father was not a king. His father Gideon denounced the kingship, but he's basically calling himself a king, because if your father's a king, what are you? You're a king too, or you will be. One commentator says, the scene almost smacks of a B-Western movie in which a gang of low-life rustlers and rabble-rousers move into town, except, of course, Shechem was already such a town. There's a feast here that's happening. It's probably some celebration of the harvest of the grapes, and they get drunk, which is something that befit Baal and Baal worship. And remember, talked a few weeks ago that they had centered their worship around Baal Berit, the Baal of the covenant. And so they're forsaking Yahweh, the God of the covenant, for a Baal. And this Baal, as many Baals, they partied, they got drunk, and they encourage you to do that as well. And so they get rowdy, and then they just start talking, as people do when they get drunk, and start having a big mouth. And they go on about how much they revile and hate Abimelech. You can practically hear Gaal drunk with wine and his flights of fancy, challenging Abimelech, who is this vicious man who has done horrible things, and yet Gaal is saying, well, I can put him in his place. Now, Zebul is a faithful officer to Abimelech. He's probably something like the governor of Shechem or some other appointed person of Abimelech to watch over Shechem. Yes, Nori? Who's the bad man? In this story, this is one of those rare stories where everybody's bad. We're not cheering for anybody here. It's kind of sad. In that story, Noah's kind of the good guy. But you know who's always the good guy in all of the stories in the Bible? God and Jesus, that's right. And so in this story, there's only one good guy, as many stories. God is the only good guy here. He's going to make the bad guys trip up on their own traps. I like those kinds of stories where the conniving, wicked men, they set all these traps for the righteous people and end up falling into it themselves. You're going to get a little bit of that, well, sort of, here with this story. Who is Hamor? Hamor might have been like the former governor before Zebul was appointed, or maybe he was one of the original founders of Shechem. He's called the father of Shechem. And so the idea was that, we've got this half Shechemite in charge of us. Abimelech's, he's only half of us. His mom's from Shechem. His daddy is an Israelite. He's one of those chosen people. So we don't even have a true Shechemite in charge of us. We need someone who's descended from Hamor. He's a real Shechemite. We need real people who grew up in this town, and their whole family's from this town. That's who should be in charge. Now, ironically, Hamor means donkey, and just gives you an idea of the kind of people that are living in this town. Just not high-quality people who would betray their family. Oh, we need a true father of Shechem here. Well, these are murderers that will betray even their family. So how far does that even go? Well, again, this just represents, again, the debauchery and the evilness and the wickedness of these men of Shechem. They're not men of character. None of them are good. They all come off like bad guys, as we just pointed out. And Gaal is just the tipping point. He is just kind of the last straw for Shechem descending into violence. And we will see that happening next in verses 34 and on. Verse 34. And of course, Zebul notifies Abimelech, and we have our second ambush of the text. He encourages Abimelech to set an ambush the next day. So again, probably close by, maybe Aruma, that's where Abimelech has been living. And Zebul secretly sends a messenger, hey, be ready for an ambush, because Gaul's going to come out, and as soon as he comes out, you just trap him. Verse 34, so Abimelech and all the men who were with him rose up by night and set an ambush against Shechem in 4 companies. And Gaul, the son of Ebed, went out and stood in the entrance of the gate of the city. And Abimelech and the people who were with him rose from the ambush. And when Gaul saw the people, he said to Zebul, look, people are coming down from the mountaintops. And Zebul said to him, you mistake the shadow of the mountains for men. Gaul spoke again and said, look, people are coming down from the center of the land, and one company is coming from the direction of the diviner's oak. Then Zebul said to him, where's your mouth now, you who said, who is Abimelech that we should serve him? Are not these the people whom you despised? Go out now and fight with them. And Gaul went out at the head of the leaders of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him, and many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. And Abimelech lived at Aruma, and Zebul drove out Gaul and his relatives so that they could not dwell at Shechem. On the following day, the people went out into the field, and Abimelech was told. He took his people and divided them into 3 companies and set an ambush in the fields. And he looked and saw the people coming out of the city. So he rose against them and killed them. Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city, while the 2 companies rushed upon all who were in the field and killed them. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He captured the city and killed the people who were in it, and he razed the city and sowed it with salt. When all the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the stronghold of the house of El-Berit. That's Baal. Abimelech was told that all the leaders of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. And Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bundle of brushwood and took it up and laid it on his shoulder. And he said to the men who were with him, what you've seen me do, hurry and do as I have done. So every one of the people cut down his bundle, and following Abimelech put it against the stronghold. And they set the stronghold on fire over them, so that all the people of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. So we have here the next day Abimelech bringing violence against, forcing Gaul to put his money where his mouth is. And Zebul is a participant in this deception. This is likely sometime in the morning, because that's the only time you might mistake shadows for people and things like that. It's just in that misty time of the morning. I've been deer hunting once, real early, and seeing a mountainside, and you can barely make out what's happening. And unless there's movement, you can't really see anything. And even there, you're like, is that a deer, or is that just a mist rising? Is that a play on my imagination? So you can imagine a Gaul out there looking at Mount Ebal or Gerizim and just thinking that there's something weird going on over there. And Zebul here is you can't really tell necessarily that anything he's saying is deceptive or traitorous just yet. Just, no, that's your mind playing tricks on you. And then when it's clear that this is, in fact, a group of men, Zebul, where's your mouth now? Or put your money where your mouth is. Here he is. And even then, he might not necessarily be showing his hand that he's betrayed Gaul. He's just telling Gaul, hey, you were talking really big last night, so here's your chance to face Abimelech. And certainly he's goading him there. And his motive himself is, of course, that Gaul would get what's coming to him. But from Gaul's point of view, not necessarily that Zebul is trying to goad him into a battle, but that is exactly what happens. And he's cut off from retreat, which is something Abimelech will do later, and they are routed. Many of them fall wounded. Zebul, or Gaul himself, his relatives, they're driven out, and they're not able to enter Shechem ever again. Now, as if it was not enough to get at Gaal, what Abimelech does next is sort of personal. He raises the city, and you gotta, in English, raise and raise, they sound the same, like R-A-I-S-E, sounds the same as R-A-Z-E, but they mean totally opposite things. So to raise a city, R-A-Z-E, means to essentially flatten it to the ground. Just bring it down to stubble, knock down every building, and so he destroys it. He destroys the town, and then he, to add insult to injury, salts it. Now, salt on the earth will ruin it. Now, it may not be the case that they salted it enough to actually destroy it. It could also be symbolic, like, may no one ever inhabit this land again. Either way, the point was, he was very mad. And it was personal, and he destroyed it and did not intend for ever it to be raised again. Yes? What is this story about? It's about a bunch of bad people who are very violent and who just backstab, getting backstabbed and having violence done to them. And they all get destroyed, all the bad people. God destroys them by letting them destroy themselves. Well, it's like if I become very powerful by stealing money from a lot of people, right? Say I got really rich from stealing from a lot of people, it would be like if someone then stole all my money from me, right? And now I have nothing. It's that kind of idea. Like it's like, could I say that's unfair if I was like, hey, you can't steal all my money, but like, how did I make so much money? I stole it from everybody else. So, which part? Yeah, it's like everybody's bad, right? In that situation, like everybody's bad, right? Yeah, so God is basically letting evil people do evil things to each other be its own judgment. Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Very perceptive. Yes, Kenneth. So Samson is another story that comes up. It's got some similarities, but in that case, Samson has a chance to kind of do things right. So it'd be kind of like if Abimelech had a chance to do things right, but he doesn't, unfortunately. Okay, so Shechem, raised, salted. And you gotta tell yourself at this point that Shechem is evil, they deserve it, and you might even want to praise Abimelech, like be on his side or something, because he's successful in it. And sometimes you read the Bible and you think, oh, because someone was successful, that God's on their side, because it happened the way they wanted it to happen. And you might even think, well, I mean, if lying and cheating is things so wrong, how come God seems to bless someone that's lying, stealing, and cheating? But it's not always the case that just because someone has success in some area of their life, that it's because God is happy with what they're doing. It could very well be that the success of someone else in doing something evil is a judgment on someone else. But God will bring judgment here to Abimelech as well. We'll see that in just a second. Give me a cup of water. I'm sorry, brother. All of a sudden, my throat got very dry. So, God is just using Abimelech here to bring judgment on the people of Shechem, but the tables are going to be turned, of course, very soon. Now, the Tower of Shechem, possibly or probably also what's called Beit Milo in chapter 9, verse 6 and verse 20, and possibly even the same thing as the house of Baal Berit, which is the temple. So it might all be the same place. The Tower of Shechem, Tower Beit Milo, the house of Baal Berit, it might be all basically the same structure. It's actually some archaeologists that discovered that this is likely the case. So they found evidence. Thank you. They found evidence that Abimelech's reign was dated around 1150 BC, based on some discoveries in the Shechem area, archaeological evidence, and that they were probably one and the same, and that this was Shechem's great temple fortress was the largest in that area. So it would have been a very impressive kind of structure. Of course, it's got 1,000 people in the tower part alone. That's a lot of people. So there's archaeological evidence for these events. And actually, it even helps maybe even time the Exodus and the conquest, which are controversial in archaeology. Anyway, okay, so once the people of the town retreat, some of them anyway, the leaders, retreat to the tower, Abimelech goes, and you read the story, they essentially bring firewood against it and set it on fire. This is ironic because Abimelech becomes an instrument of the destruction of the house of an idol, right? Like, God is even using his evil acts to destroy the temple, the house of a pagan idolatrous god, Baal. And it's ironic because Gideon got his start in destroying the idol of his hometown his father had set up. That's why his nickname is Jerubbaal, because that means, right, contends with Baal. So Abimelech here, ironically, but for completely different reasons, ends up also contending against Baal, but it's not because he's being righteous or just or obeying the Lord. It's just, again, God is using an evil person to bring judgment against an evil God, little g. John Trapp offers his commentary. This was as if a man should run into a stack of straw or barrel of gunpowder to secure himself from a raging fire. Their covenant with Baal, that image of jealousy, was the cause of their ruin. They looked upon this hold as both a fort and a sanctuary, but it saved them not. See, the reason they're being judged is because they are Baal worshipers. So for them to run to a tower of Baal, essentially, for safety and sanctuary, John Trapp says, is to run to a barrel of gunpowder in order to be saved from destruction. They don't realize that their cause of death then is not so much the fires of Abimelech, it's their own idolatry, is their own idol worship. Now, with this is the fulfillment of Jotham's curse, because he mentions this fire when he gave his little parable about the trees and asking for a king and all that stuff. And it ends with the bramble. The tree's asking the bramble, if you remember, to be their king. And the bramble says, if you are not anointing me king in good faith, then let fire come out and devour you. And then in verse 20, speaking now plainly, not in the story, he says, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beit Milo. That's this thing we're talking about. And let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and from Beit Milo and devour Abimelech. So there's going to be a mutual destruction here, which we'll get to. So again, irony, the Shechemites who probably cheered when 70 men were killed by the hand of Abimelech were now on the receiving end of the violence, and you know they were not cheering at that moment as judgment came for them, the same kind of judgment that they laid out, injustice really, they laid out for Abimelech's brothers. We come to then, lastly, a fitting finale. Verse 50 and on. Then Abimelech went to Thebez and encamped against Thebez and captured it. But there was a strong tower within the city. So a lot of towers. There's just common for a city to have a big tower in it. There's a strong tower within the city, and all the men and women and all the leaders of the city fled to it and shut themselves in, and they went up to the roof of the tower. And Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. Deja vu. And a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor-bearer, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, 'A woman killed him.'" And his young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everyone departed to his home. Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. Thebez is about 10 to 13 miles northeast of Shechem, perhaps modern Tubas. What had Thebez done? Well, the text doesn't say. Maybe there were rumors of insurrection there, that they had caught the same kind of treacherous attitude that Shechem had. But in any case, Abimelech did not like what they were doing and what they were up to, and he was hoping for a repeat of the same success at Shechem. What should Shechem have taught him? Shechem should have taught him, my whole career here started with violence and treachery, and now the words of Jotham just came true that I've destroyed Shechem. The next part of Jotham's curse was that I was going to be destroyed as well. Maybe I should get the picture here that if I continue this violence and treachery, it's going to come back on me. That God is not blessing my success. God is bringing judgment, and I'm next for that. So when you see someone, he should have got that. It should have been in his mind, if he had the heart to see it, to realize then and there, I'm the one that's next on the chopping block. If they are judged in this way, well, what about the man who killed his brothers? No such wherewithal here. Yes, Nori? Obsessed? Is that what I said? Oh. Obsessed is when you think about something way too much than is probably healthy for you. And you're always thinking about it. Usually it's something you want really bad, and nothing can distract you from thinking about that thing or wanting that thing. And usually it's not good, because then you start forgetting the things you need to do and the things that might be more important. So, good question. I don't even remember using the word, so. All right, so instead, though, of having that wherewithal, he comes against Thebez, and once again, you think that this is going to be the same thing all over. Here's another tower. Everyone's fleeing into it. Boys, get the wood. We're going to have another barbecue. But a certain woman drops a millstone. Now, a millstone was used to grind grain. And an upper millstone, so there'd be two parts to it. The bottom part tended to be much heavier, so you wouldn't necessarily chuck that out of a window. But the top one, maybe, let's say, 20 or 30 pounds, maybe more than that. And again, we have this irony. There are heroic tales and feats of strength about bringing doom upon the enemies of God in the book of Judges. And frankly, even up till this point, in the Bible, you have heroic tales of Joshua and Moses and Pharaoh, and you see all of this. But perhaps second only to Samson, bringing down the roof on the Philistines in terms of heroic tales and feats, is this woman hoisting up a 20, 30-pound millstone and just chucking it out a window, and it happening to fall on Abimelech's head. Now, is this because she's a very good marksman? No. It's because God is a very good marksman, right? God is the one that is aiming this millstone at Abimelech's head, not this woman. And it's almost mundane that after all of the drama, all of the violence and treachery, it's like The Godfather, with all of the backstabbing, all these things that have happened, even the end of Gideon's life and the beginning of Abimelech's life, for it to just conclude with one verse: a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head, crushed his skull. And that's it. That's all that it takes. It's nothing glamorous. It's nothing even, let's say, dramatic. It is as simple as a woman, probably not a combatant, not a soldier, just a woman who is terrified for her life, fleeing, and just being desperate, starting throwing things out the window. And here it is, Abimelech meets his end. And, It was deliberate in the sense that she's just throwing stuff out the windows. But I don't know if she was like lining up the shot and like, like this. Like, I've never thrown an upper millstone out of a window before. I don't know that she's cleaning house or anything. I think it was meant to be a defensive measure, but I don't know that she was, calculating wind trajectory and, like taking angles and, yeah. Well, the reason it says a certain woman is likely that no one knows who it was exactly that did it. It was just so much chaos, right? That just all that you know is a woman. Certainly he knew it was a woman that did it because he says, let not a woman kill me. So he knew it was a woman, but nameless, just another face in the crowd, not any hero or soldier, but just a woman in panic, desperation, just start throwing things out of the window. I think of movies like, just any movie that has siege warfare in it where like the women just start, people just start throwing things over the edge when people are coming up on ladders. It's just that kind of thing. You're just desperate. It's panicky. It's not intended, I think, to be any precise tactical maneuver. It's just a woman just, what else are you going to do? You can either curl up and die, or you just start throwing stuff out the window. So it's intended to be kind of like mundane. It's intended to be just like a verse that happens because in doing that and making it so succinct, it's saying this is providence. This is 100% God orchestrating the minutest details of these events so that woman and that millstone are there at that moment so that this could happen. It's precise in the sense that God's providence is precise. So I appreciate it. It's just when justice can happen so quickly or judgment can happen so quickly like that, almost unexpected. Look, we often ask, where's the justice, where's the judgment when something bad happens? And yet there are moments where it just happens like that. Sometimes justice is slow, sometimes justice is delayed, sometimes you have to wait till the end of time for someone to really get what's coming to them. But there are times where someone just immediately gets killed after doing something evil or wicked. There are times when God's judgment comes upon a person and they had no chance at all to get right even with the Lord. And so in a way, you don't know when a millstone's going to drop on your head. So, be right with God. Now, incidentally, Saul, again, with the parallels between Abimelech and Saul, besides the evil spirit, when Saul meets his end, a similar thing kind of happens where he is struck almost blindly by an arrow, but it was God's arrow, hits him, and because he doesn't want to be killed in that way, he asks his armor bearer to kill him as well. So it's sort of a history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme sort of situation. But there are parallels you could find here. Won't dig into that. But Jotham's curse, God's judgment, it comes to pass. Everyone, once they realize Abimelech is dead, just everyone goes home. It's so funny how instantly the situation gets diffused. Like, as soon as Abimelech's gone, everyone's back to, almost like a spell is broken that was over them. They just go back home. Now, it doesn't take long to see that, of course, the book of Judges keeps going on, so it's not like they learn their lesson, but it's just interesting when you think historically how oftentimes as soon as someone dies, that everyone that was whipping everyone up into a frenzy, as soon as that person dies, it's like a spell's broken, like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have done that. You just think of World War II and other conflicts like that. As soon as the main madman dies, it's like, what were we doing and why were we doing this? All it took was just one person to really to whip people up into that kind of frenzy. So it seems Abimelech was that kind of person. And that's, in terms of now thinking of themes and applications, I think generally you're supposed to read the Bible and realize, while this is happening in just very small geographic area, right? Very small geographic area. You can think of like Orange County. All of this could have happened just in Orange County. But the kinds of people that we're talking about and the kinds of events that are coming to pass and the kinds of themes, they're universal. They've happened many times, not just in biblical history, but history around the world. that we see people involved in treachery and violence rise to power, and then of course they get their own comeuppance when the next person is even more treacherous and violent, right? We're supposed to see a pattern in this because the pattern is human nature, our fallenness. Yes? Oh, what Bible verse? We're in Judges chapter 9. We're kind of just talking about the whole thing now, wrapping it up. So thank you. I appreciate that you're paying attention here. That means a lot to me. Thank you. All right, Psalm 11:5. The psalmist says this about God. Psalm 11:5. Yahweh tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. There's never been a time in history, human history, where God has ever been okay with violence. And by violence, we don't just mean, say, a physical act of hurting another person, but the heart behind it that wants to afflict someone else in order to gain something for themselves. Because obviously there are some kinds of violence, if you just mean like hitting a person, that would be justified, self-defense and things like that. We're talking about violence that comes from a heart that is utterly selfish, has no respect for others, certainly doesn't honor that we are all made in the image of God. Psalm 11:5. If you remember back in Genesis 6, when God brought this flood, speaking of Noah that was brought up earlier, one of the hallmarks of the people at that time is exactly this. Now the earth was corrupt. This is Genesis 6:11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on earth. And a few verses before it says that he saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So the earth was full of violence. That's one of the reasons that God brought judgment, a worldwide judgment. And again, it's not just the physical acts of hurting or hitting people, but when we do it in wanting to get something for ourselves and wanting something selfish through that, using our force, our power, our might to bring ourselves on someone for our own good and our own gain. There's poetic justice in the Bible in allowing something God hates to judge and destroy another thing God hates. Sort of what's happening here. That's what's intended by the end of Judges 9 there, where it says that God returned or made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads, right? It's the idea that God is using evil men to judge evil men. And he does this. Again, this is another pattern of history sort of thing as well, not just in the Bible, but in life as well. But when God brings the Assyrians against Israel or the Babylonians against Judah, they are evil people. The Babylonians and the Assyrians are wicked, evil people. They'd skin you alive, behead you, stick it on a pole, all sorts of nasty stuff. They're violent, wicked men. But God was going to use these evil, wicked, violent men to bring judgment against another group of evil, wicked, violent men, his own people, the Israelites. And then he would also judge Assyria and Babylon. In a way, you could think of it like, unfortunately, the world is sort of a cycle of that, where evil, one of God's mechanisms for bringing judgment on evil is with other evil people. It's sort of the nature of living in a sin-cursed world. We live in a sin-cursed world, and it's not that evil is as rampant as it could possibly be at any given moment. Like, we're always maximal evil, and everyone's doing as evil as much as they possibly could. It's on 11. It doesn't mean that, but being in a sin-cursed world does mean that the spiritual gravity of creation is just always pulling towards evil. And it's a classic tale that if you use violence and treachery as your tools, you can't be surprised when those are used against you. I mean, again, the Godfather, almost any kind of gangland type story, the rise and fall of governments and empires, when it's built on treachery and violence, You're just not surprised when treachery and violence is what brings them down. One commentator writes, William MacDonald, he says, "Justice has its own way of suiting the punishment to the crime. Abimelech had slain his brothers on a stone, and a stone crushed his own proud head. Those who live by violence will die by the same." There's many proverbs that speak of violent men being setting up an ambush almost against themselves. And the ambush, that theme, we see at least 3 ambushes in that passage. The idea of those who lie in wait to plan evil against someone else, oftentimes we'll find that someone has made plans to lie in wait and bring evil against them. That's the nature of it. So here, when an evil spirit afflicts the evil people of Shechem and the evil man Abimelech, you could almost say that God's active involvement, his providence, his sovereignty, is simply in allowing evil to run its full course without intervention. The natural consequence of evil is more evil. Violence begets violence, treachery begets treachery, evil begets evil. And just because God lets you succeed in some evil endeavor doesn't mean that the point is to keep doing evil. Instead, on the one hand, maybe God is using you as an instrument of judgment against someone else. On the other, this is telling you of God's patience. God was very patient with Abimelech. He should have just wiped him out, right? As soon as he had the treacherous thought to even kill his brothers. There's a lot of patience here in all of the Bible's stories. He could have repented. He should have repented, and yet he didn't. When God allows evil to happen, maybe he is bringing evil upon someone else's evil, using my stupidity, my sin, to judge someone else's sin. At the same time, I don't need to want to be that kind of person. I can repent and be thankful for God's forgiveness. And so if you're not a Christian tonight, the idea here is you've obviously experienced evil. You've obviously probably done evil. It's part of God's plan. But his intention is not that we would ultimately then be a victim of our own evilness, which is, in a sense, the judgment that is to come. If we stand before God as having done evil, then his judgment will come against that. Whether we faced an evil consequence in this life, we will certainly face it in the next. But God, in his love and mercy, he forgives even evil people of doing evil things, even the most evil and wicked things, like Paul of Tarsus, who murdered Christians, and yet he became an apostle. God is able to forgive the evil that we've done if we would do the hard thing. It strikes at our pride, but of saying, God, I need your forgiveness, I need your salvation, I can't do it on my own. This is the message of the gospel and the cross of Jesus Christ, who, though he was God, lived perfectly as a man, never treated anyone in a wrong way, and yet was the victim of much evil. But even in that being a victim of evil, he never became evil. He died as a perfect man on our behalf. He offers to substitute his own life for ours so that we are like the ones who died on the cross, or he is like the one who died on the cross, or is the one who died on the cross for our sins, and I get to be treated as the Son of God. If you will believe in that by faith, then you too can be a Christian. You too can have your sins forgiven. If you are a Christian tonight, and maybe just a reminder here that evil does have its comeuppance, oftentimes in this life. Really, I mean, there's plenty of times where evil people have something evil happen to them. Should we rejoice in that? Maybe to a certain degree. You do want to see justice made. If you're Jotham here, I don't know how excited you are, because at the end of the day, a bunch of people died. Maybe even your own relatives. On the other hand, this is the consequence of sin. And we should rejoice that justice hasn't been made. There's a tension there. You never hear about Jotham again, but was he happy this happened? Yes, but no. I mean, all the death and destruction that could have been avoided. So maybe we need the reminder as well to hold those both. Not be so excited when evil people are judged because we want their repentance. On the other hand, to be thankful that justice does come, that God does bring his justice to people.